The Ocean of Fire, the complete saga of Tariq Ibn Ziyaad. The Chains and the Calling. Long before he stood at the edge of Europe, before ships burned and empires fell, Tariq Ibn Ziyaad Ibn Ziyaad was a man with no throne, no kingdom, and no name of power. He was a Berber, a son of the rugged Atlas Mountains of North Africa. His people had long lived between worlds, the desert and the sea, paganism and Islam, oppression and revolution. Tariq Ibn Ziyaad was likely born into a tribe known for its toughness, people shaped by stone and sun, who walked barefoot over sharp earth with pride. But Tariq Ibn Ziyaad's early life remained shrouded in mystery, a deliberate forgetting by the historians of courts. What we do know is that he was once a slave. Not a slave in chains forever, but a man who bore that weight long enough to know what it meant to be crushed. He served under Musa ibn Nusair, the Umayyad governor of Africa, modern-day Tunisia and Algeria. It was Musa who recognized something in the young Berber. Perhaps it was his fiery loyalty. Perhaps it was the quiet intelligence in his eyes. Or perhaps Musa, a former slave himself, saw in Tariq Ibn Ziyaad a reflection of the fire that once burned in his own chest. He freed him. And not only freed him, he trained him. Tariq Ibn Ziyaad grew under Musa's command. He studied the Quran and the art of war side by side. He became a general not just by sword, but by sincerity. And when the time came to select a leader for a mission so bold it bordered on madness, Musa called upon his most unlikely commander. A freed Berber. A general with no crown. A man who had nothing to lose, and everything to give. The whisper of Al-Andalus. In the year 710 CE, reports began to trickle into North Africa. Across the sea, in the land known as Hispania, the once mighty Visigothic kingdom was crumbling. Their king, Roderick, was facing rebellion, betrayal, and deep unrest. Some of the Christian princes and oppressed Jewish communities began sending messages across the straits to the Muslims. Come. Help us. We will support you. Musa hesitated. The caliph in Damascus had not authorized a full-scale invasion of Europe. So he sent a scout, a young commander named Tariq Ibn Ziyaad Ibn Ziyaad, with a small force of 1,700 to 2,000 men, mostly Berber Muslims. Tariq Ibn Ziyaad's eyes first fell on Jabal al-Tariq Ibn Ziyaad, the mountain of Tariq Ibn Ziyaad, as it would later be called, when he crossed the narrow blue line between Africa and Europe. The land before him shimmered in green. Behind him, the deserts of North Africa still breathed heat. He could turn back, or he could make history. Burning the ships. In April 711, Tariq Ibn Ziyaad and his men landed on the shores near what is now Gibraltar. The warriors stepped off their ships in silence. The sea behind them murmured softly, but in Tariq Ibn Ziyaad's heart there was thunder. As the men set up camp, Tariq Ibn Ziyaad did the unthinkable. He ordered all the ships to be burned. His commanders were stunned. "Why have you done this?" they cried. "How will we return?" Tariq Ibn Ziyaad stood before them and gave a speech that would echo for centuries. "The enemy is before you, and the sea is behind you. You have nothing left now but courage and faith." It was not cruelty. It was clarity. Tariq Ibn Ziyaad knew, armies retreat when they have the option. But warriors of truth march forward when the only road is through. This was not a raid. It was a reckoning. The Battle of Guadalete. King Roderick had finally gathered a massive army, reportedly numbering between 40,000 and 100,000 men. Tariq Ibn Ziyaad, in contrast, had barely 12,000, even after reinforcements. The two forces met near the Guadalete River in July of 711. The battlefield was a cauldron of heat, tension, and prayers. On the eve of battle, Tariq Ibn Ziyaad stood under the stars and wept. Not from fear. from trust. He made long duet that night, and when he stood before his men the next morning, his voice was calm but fierce. Fight as men who believe in the hereafter. Fight not for wealth or for vengeance, but for the one who made us all. The battle raged for days. Dust and blood covered the ground. But Roderick's army was torn apart not just by the Muslims, but by internal betrayal among his own nobles. Tariq ibn Ziyad's forces struck like lightning, strategic, fearless, unified. Roderick fell in battle, and the Visigothic kingdom crumbled. The opening of Al-Andalus. After the crushing defeat of Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete, the gates of Hispania swung wide open. Tariq ibn Ziyaad, though vastly outnumbered at the start, had not only won a battle, he had set in motion a tidal wave that would change the very fabric of Europe. The Visigothic kingdom, leaderless and fractured, began to collapse like ancient stone under the force of destiny. Tariq ibn Ziyaad wasted no time. With righteous discipline and respect for the populations they encountered, his forces advanced northward. The Muslim army captured city after city, Isija, Córdoba, Granada, and Toledo, the Visigothic capital itself. But conquest was not done through brutality. The dhimmi principle of Islam, granting protection to Christians and Jews under Muslim rule, was extended to local populations. Synagogues that had been closed by the Visigoths were reopened. Entire Jewish communities, long oppressed by Christian kings, welcomed Tariq ibn Ziyad's soldiers with cautious gratitude. It wasn't a campaign of plunder. It was a campaign of transformation. From the minarets of Africa, the call to prayer now echoed across the hills of Spain. And yet, even in victory, Tariq ibn Ziyaad walked with humility. His messages back to Musa ibn Nusayr were not filled with self-praise, but gratitude to Allah and deference to his commander. But trouble was coming, not from the Visigoths, but from within. The shadow of politics. The speed and scale of Tariq ibn Ziyad's conquests created suspicion in Musa ibn Nusayr. News reached him that his general, once a servant, had taken the capital of Toledo, amassed treasure, and negotiated with local leaders. Perhaps it was jealousy. Perhaps it was fear that the caliph would recognize Tariq ibn Ziyad's glory and forget Musa. Perhaps it was political caution. Whatever the reason, Musa ordered Tariq ibn Ziyaad to halt, but the message arrived late. By the time Musa crossed into Spain himself, Tariq ibn Ziyaad had already conquered nearly half the peninsula. The meeting between them was tense. Historical accounts vary. Some say Musa rebuked him publicly, others say they reconciled. But behind the scenes, a slow storm brewed, not of battle, but of pride and position. The Caliph, Al-Walid I, summoned both men to Damascus. Tariq ibn Ziyaad, the conqueror of Spain, left behind the very land he had opened, under orders never to return again. Damascus and silence. When Tariq ibn Ziyaad arrived in Damascus, he was met not with celebration, but silence. The Caliph was aging and cautious. The Umayyad court was rife with politics, jealousy, and shifting loyalties. Tariq ibn Ziyaad, the Berber general who had changed the map of the world, was pushed into obscurity. No titles. No governorship. No palace. He was neither punished nor rewarded, simply forgotten. He had burned his ships. He had risked his life. He had carried the banner of Islam into Europe with less than 12,000 men and returned with empires at his feet. And yet, he vanished into the shadows of history. We do not know exactly how Tariq ibn Ziyaad died. No mausoleum bears his name. No court poets sang his praises after his death. Some say he lived in Damascus in quiet reflection. Others believe he returned to North Africa and died in poverty. But the flame he lit in Al-Andalus would not go out. The legacy of the lion. Though Tariq ibn Ziyaad faded, Al-Andalus rose. From the soil he conquered grew centuries of Islamic civilization, art, science, architecture, medicine, poetry. Cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada would later shine as jewels of the Muslim world, drawing scholars from the East and West alike. The libraries of Al-Andalus preserved ancient Greek knowledge, translated it into Arabic, and eventually reintroduced it to Europe, sparking the Renaissance centuries later. This was not merely a conquest of territory. It was a conquest of ignorance, with knowledge, beauty, and light. And yet, the man who made it possible remains one of history's most silent giants. There are no known images of him. No recorded speeches beyond the burning of the ships. No elaborate tomb. But maybe that's how he wanted it. Maybe Tariq ibn Ziyaad understood something that even kings forget. That true glory lies not in being remembered, but in changing the world in the name of the one who never forgets. The silent years. Tariq ibn Ziyaad, the man who had crossed the sea, burned his ships, and faced a kingdom with no promise of return, now found himself in the quiet courtyards of Damascus. Not a prisoner, not a king. Just forgotten. Some sources suggest that he lived the remainder of his life in modesty and reflection. A few claim that he was assigned minor duties, perhaps in administration or even as a scribe, the kind of work far below the stature of a man who once stood at the head of armies. It was a bitter irony. In the bustling halls of Damascus, new names rose. Poets sang of warriors who never held a sword. Politicians wrote of victories they never won. The people had already begun to forget who truly opened the gates of Spain. But Tariq ibn Ziyaad, the quiet Berber warrior, never raised his voice. He did not fight for recognition. He had not crossed the ocean for titles. He had done it for Islam, for a world where the oppressed could find justice, where the people of the book could live in peace, where knowledge would replace tyranny. And perhaps that is why, even in his silence, his presence lingered. The blossoming of Al-Andalus. Back in the land he had conquered, Al-Andalus began to breathe on its own. Though Tariq ibn Ziyaad never returned, his legacy lived in the foundations of cities and in the hearts of a new generation of Muslims, Christians, and Jews who began building a society like no other. Streets were lit with lamps while Europe's kingdoms remained in darkness. Libraries in Córdoba housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Physicians in Al-Andalus treated patients with techniques centuries ahead of their time. The great mosque of Córdoba stood like a crown of stone and light, a tribute to the civilization birthed by faith and courage. It was in these moments, not just in battle, but in books, in prayer, in peace, that the real victory of Tariq ibn Ziyaad unfolded. Musa's downfall. The man who had once doubted Tariq ibn Ziyaad, Musa ibn Nusayr, faced his own fall from grace. Though he too was summoned to Damascus and initially received with respect, the death of Caliph al-Walid changed everything. The new caliph, Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik, was no friend to Musa. Soon after arriving, Musa was stripped of his titles and wealth. His sons were imprisoned. His reputation faded like dust in the wind. And in that loss, he may have finally understood the value of the man he had once rebuked. Two great men, one born a general, the other born a servant, now stood side by side in the oblivion of history. Yet history, like the ocean Tariq ibn Ziyaad once crossed, does not forget the shape of those who move through it. Reflections before the end. No one recorded the final words of Tariq ibn Ziyaad. But one can imagine him, an old man walking quietly in the gardens of Damascus, watching children play with wooden swords, their eyes wide with dreams of far-off lands. Did he ever miss Al-Andalus? Did he dream of Córdoba's white walls or the rivers of Seville? Or did he simply raise his hands and whisper thanks to the one who gave him purpose? O Allah, you are the master of all lands. You grant victory not to the strongest army, but to the most sincere heart. Perhaps that was enough for him. To live with a heart unburdened by pride. To die with a legacy untouched by corruption. To serve and vanish, like the setting sun that leaves behind a world lit with dawn. What we inherit. Today, the Rock of Gibraltar still bears his name, Jabal Tariq Ibn Ziyaad, the mountain of Tariq Ibn Ziyaad. Across Spain and North Africa, echoes of his story remain, in place names, in oral traditions, in forgotten graves. He left behind no golden palace, no crown, no heir. But what he gave was far greater. He gave a new world to Islam. He gave dignity to the Berbers, who until then had been seen as second class. He showed that leadership was not born of blood, but of courage. He proved that faith, when absolute, can move mountains, burn ships, and rewrite empires. The last stand of his spirit. Centuries later, when the Muslims were finally expelled from Al-Andalus, and the great mosques turned into cathedrals, many wept not just for the loss of land, but for the loss of something more sacred, the memory of a righteous beginning. The Christians who conquered Spain remembered Tariq ibn Ziyaad too. They spoke of him with awe, calling him the Black General, the sea-born lion, the unstoppable flame. Even his enemies saw him not as a barbarian, but as a man of order, faith, and vision. His spirit still breathes in the architecture, in the gardens of Alhambra, in the silence of Andalusian hills. And in every student who seeks knowledge, in every voice that rises for justice, in every believer who walks into the unknown with tawakkul, Tariq ibn Ziyaad walks again. And so he burned the ships. Not just wood and sail, but fear, hesitation, and the possibility of retreat. And in doing so, he lit a fire that would not die for 800 years.